We were aroused by the shrill whistle of the locomotive and marched down from our somewhat elevated position to take the train. But delays ensued as usual, and it was daybreak before we started. The cars were filled to their utmost capacity, and I rode part of the way on the platform and part on top of a car. The engine made slow time, and there were frequent stops. Having had scanty fare since leaving Winchester, indeed dating from before that in our company, the blackberries on the side of the embankment were an irresistible temptation during these stops. But while the side of the road was crowded with eager pickers on one of these occasions, I heard a voice exclaiming furiously, "If I had a sword, I would cut you down where you stand." And raising my eyes, I beheld the crowd scattering for the cars before an officer striding up from the rear. I stood still but felt very uncomfortable as he came up close and glared at me, thinking he was going to strike me and wondering what I would do. And when he turned off, I was glad to regain my position on the car top. This was Brigadier General Kirby Smith, but we did not know him, seeing him thus for the first time, so we straggled from the cars no more. As we neared Manassas Junction, we distinctly heard the booming of cannon at intervals, and could even see the smoke from some of the discharges a few miles to the left. But we had no idea that a general engagement was then actually going on. We arrived at the railroad junction, a few hundred yards west of the station, about 1 p.m., and immediately disembarking, threw off our knapsacks into a pile and formed in line. Colonel Elzey galloped down the front, his eyes sparkling, followed by General Kirby Smith, who, with the back of his hand raised to the front of his cap, exclaimed, "This is the signal, men. The watchword is Sumter." This was to distinguish friend from foe. Enthusiastic cheers were given in response, and I now suddenly realized that we were going straight into our first battle, and without the Bible preparation I had hoped to have. We were marched north, partly across the country, towards the firing, which, cannon and musketry, became more and more distinct, and as of a real battle. We took a quick step at first, but presently in our excitement broke into a double quick, with a cheer, and kept up that gait for a considerable time, the whole distance passed over being about 5 miles. The dust was most distressing, so thick at times that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead of one, and floating high above the treetops, so that, as is well known, the enemy were able to trace the march of our column and mark its progress as we did theirs. Once we halted for a few minutes and, being parched with thirst, some of the men eagerly lapped the muddy water which stood in the fresh, deep prints of horses' feet in the road, a little miry at that point, while others picked a few huckleberries on the right and left. As we neared the front, the signs were very discouraging, would have been so to older troops, and were particularly calculated to try the nerves of raw soldiers. We passed a great many wounded, and still more unwounded, going to the rear, many of whom assured us that we were getting cut to pieces this time. We were catching hell. We were sure to be whipped, but to go. Sometimes a man with no greater injury than a finger hurt would be supported by a comrade or two on either side. Wagons and ambulances with wounded and dead also drove by. Twice we passed directly over regiments lying as flat as they could get to the ground, some of the men raising their heads and feebly exhorting us to go in, to which our fellows responded with an invitation in strong language to come in with us themselves. Marching steadily, we presently came out into an open field, the ground rising to a low crest in front, behind, this side of, which was drawn up a small body of horse, which I understood to be the Black Horse Troop. This was a little way to our right. Here a shell exploded 70 or 80 yards to the right, our first shot from an enemy. After halting for a few minutes, we again moved forward, and some shots began to fall closer. I saw one shell strike in a ravine 15 yards to the right, which burst with what I thought was a tremendous explosion. Soon after the head of the column passed a low thicket which had screened us in front, when there was a succession of sharp reports like a pack of firecrackers, and many bullets whistled around. A shell also exploded quite close to the side of the column. I saw General Kirby Smith, who was riding a little on my right, fall from his horse, and two men, John Berryman and another man I did not recognize, of Dorsey's company, which was leading, also fell to the ground not more than 15 or 20 feet in front of me. I had insensibly gotten ahead and was then with the file closers of Company C. Only these two companies had got well out into the open ground. Looking around, I saw that the file closers had crossed over to the other, left side of the column, under the impression that the firing came from our own men in rear, and that the last half of our company had squatted down to the ground, looking about for the hidden enemy. The first half went on, however, and I with it, feeling as if in a dream. The whole thing was so sudden, unexpected, and novel. I passed directly by the two men who had been shot, Berryman raising himself on his elbow with an expression of agony, having received a terrible wound in the groin. I did not soon forget. The firing soon ceased, and although the regiment was quickly ordered to form line forward on First Company, and the movement was executed with tolerable promptness under the circumstances, we encountered no further opposition. The enemy, a skirmish line of New York Zouaves, having hastily retreated. We therefore lay down just in rear of a slight eminence, some shells passing overhead, while Colonel Elzey, who succeeded General Smith in command of the brigade, rode off to reconnoiter. It must have been now about 3 o'clock. Colonel Elzey soon returned and moved us first to the left, oblique in column across open ground, and then forward in line of battle through a wood, the Maryland regiment now in the center, and when about 20 or 30 yards from its further edge, we received an unexpected volley and saw a line drawn up on high ground in the middle of the field beyond. Colonel Elzey, who happened to be immediately behind the left of our company, called out to his aide-de-camp, "My glass, Comte, quick, quick!" His staff gathered around him, and all peered anxiously through and under the foliage, which partly obstructed the view. After looking through his glass for a few moments, Elzey dropped his hand, his eye lighted up. I was a few feet directly in front of him, and he hastily cried, "Stars and stripes! Stars and stripes! Give it to them, boys!" The words were scarcely out of his mouth, the men seeming to take the command from his eye, when a rolling volley was poured into the enemy. Once or twice we loaded and fired, or many did, and we had the satisfaction of seeing the line disappear behind the crest in confusion. I think it doubtful if we did much execution, and on our side we had only one man killed, Private Swisher, although the bullets cut off twigs and leaves overhead. The left of our company had got crowded up, several deep during this volley, and Nick Watkins in firing shot through the cap of George Lemon, who was in his front. Taking off his damaged cap and looking at it, George turned slowly around and in his drawling tone said reproachfully, "Nick Watkins, what did you do that for?" The order was now given to charge bayonets. Only our two right companies, Dorsey's and Murray's, had bayonets, and we pressed forward with a cheer, not in a very regular line, but each one striving to be foremost. But in passing over the stubble or pasture field, we discovered it bore an abundant crop of blackberries, and being famished with hunger and our throats parched with thirst, the temptation was too strong to be resisted. The men stopped with one accord, and the charging line of battle resolved itself into a crowd of blackberry pickers. Officers swore or exhorted according to their different principles, and presently succeeded in getting the line to move on. Still, whenever an unusually attractive bush was passed over, we reached down without stopping and stripped off berries, leaves, and briars, which we crammed into our mouths. For several days afterwards, I was occupied extracting the thorns from the palms of my hands. Just before reaching the top of the ridge, we were halted, and Colonel Elzey ordered Lieutenant Chesney of his staff to ride forward and see if there was any enemy on the other side, a duty which he performed in a very gallant manner and to our great admiration. No enemy was to be seen, and he waved us forward, and we advanced some distance over the open ground until near a pine wood in front, or a little to the left. At this moment, an irregular fire was poured into this wood by a part of our line, it being supposed that the enemy had halted there, and some asserting that from it a fire had been first opened on us. Our fire was presently stopped by the exertions of the officers, but the entire line, consisting of the 1st Maryland, 10th Virginia, and 3rd Tennessee, was halted while the Newtown Battery, attached to our brigade, shelled the woods for some time. When this ceased, we again advanced and had scarcely entered the woods when we saw abundant evidence of the place having been occupied by the enemy and of our execution, both from artillery and small arms, for I do not think it had been the scene of a conflict earlier in the day. At one spot I noticed 5 Federal casualties lying close together, and their faces seemed to me to be already turning dark in the intense heat of the weather. Their guns, mini muskets, were lying near, but I hesitated to appropriate one in exchange for my smoothbore. We passed other dispatched Yankees, but came to the edge of the open ground without encountering a living enemy. The line having been a good deal disarranged in passing through the thick old field pines, we now halted to reform it. A little stream ran along the front, but in our inexperience, many of the men would not drink from it, being told there were or might be dead or wounded in it. Here a stranger was observed to take a place in our ranks who attempted to pass himself off as a stray South Carolinian, but on cross-examination he proved to be a Federal straggler and was taken into custody. Repenting that I had not taken one of the mini-guns seen while passing through the woods, I now asked permission of Captain Murray to take advantage of the halt to run back for it. This being granted, a few steps carried me within the dense foliage which seemed to have the effect of shutting out all sound of conflict and every other. It was literally as still as death, and a disagreeable feeling succeeded to excitement, tempting me to give up my enterprise and get back among my comrades. Besides, it struck me as not unlikely that I might fall in with some stray party of the enemy, especially as we did not know how the battle was going on our right and left. Cocking my piece, I walked cautiously on, looking about and listening. I presently stumbled against something which gave a metallic ring, and, looking down, perceived what I took to be a bright piece of lead pipe, bent in the shape of a siphon, and wondered how it got there. But a closer examination showed it was a gun barrel, which had probably been struck on the end by one of Beckham's shells. I had scarcely taken 10 steps more when I was startled by hearing a voice calling me, and discovered a man lying with his head and shoulders propped against a tree. Walking over to him, I saw that he evidently had but a short time to live, an hour or 2 at most, being horribly torn about the waist by a shell. He belonged to a Maine regiment, was a fine-looking man of middle age, having a heavy dark beard, and belonging to a respectable class in society. I told him I was sorry to see him in such a condition. Was there anything I could do? Yes, he replied in a perfectly composed manner. You can do one thing for me, and I wish you to do it for God's sake. Take your bayonet and run me through. Kill me at once and put an end to this. I replied that I could not do that, and remembering what I had read of the sufferings of wounded men on battlefields, asked if he did not want some water. He answered, yes, but that made no matter, and reiterated his request to be put out of misery. I told him he had but a few more hours to live, and recommended him to make his preparation for death. He said he was ready to die, and earnestly, but without excitement, begged me to run my bayonet through his heart. Having no canteen, I ran back to the company where I found Thomas H. Levering and got him to go back with me. He drank eagerly, but still begged us to kill him, and as we moved away, his voice followed us until we were out of hearing. Without much difficulty, I found the place where I had before observed the 5 mini-guns and hastily selected one and a set of accoutrements, which had evidently belonged to one of the dead men lying nearby. While doing so, I heard Levering's voice, who had gone in a slightly different direction, calling out that he had found a wounded man trying to cut his own throat. I told him to take away the knife, which, stooping down, he apparently did. We rejoined the company just as the line was about to move forward. We continued advancing, not all the time in line of battle, I think, until we came to the Warrenton and Centerville Turnpike Road, but did not overtake the enemy, now in full retreat along his whole front. We found here a lot of haversacks and other stuff, and I made a good meal out of one, in spite of a comrade's earnest warning that the rations might be poisoned. It contained crackers, beef, and mixed ground coffee and sugar. From this mixture I sucked out the sugar and chewed the coffee.
If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more content like this, be sure to take a shot at the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest BirdDogg content. And if you'd like to support the channel, for a limited time there's exclusive Civil War Diaries merchandise available in the video link below.